Hey guys, it's Shadow. Today we're going to be ranking all of the AB2 historical battles. I already did a video on the campaigns. If you want to check that out, the link is just in the description. So first of all, we have Agincourt. Agincourt is a fixed forces scenario, and generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of fixed forces scenarios. I did like that you could destroy buildings to get certain technologies and stuff like that. That did make it a little more interesting than your average fixed forces scenario. But for me, the end goal was very simple to achieve. It wasn't a very exciting mission and it wasn't very difficult. So it's going to be in the D tier. Bathius, on the other hand, was a kind of interesting to me because you could marry off your sultan to one of the princesses and then get them as an ally, which I found quite an interesting mechanic. You also could skip over this entirely and decide to fight all of the enemies. I haven't actually done this yet, but there is an achievement for that. I would like to do that at some point. For me, it's a B tier scenario. It's not revolutionary. It's essentially a destroy them all kind of mission. Uh, but it is fun enough. Bukhara is one of the grindiest scenarios that I can think of. You start off against a much stronger opponent than yourself, the White Huns, that you have to pay tribute to stop them attacking you. Uh, the Gokturks eventually are one of the bigger opponents as well. The Hun Raiders also make your life a living misery as well. The only way I found to make this mission more bearable was to find a way of making it so the Hun Raiders would most likely resign. And that actually is if you attack their early bases, sometimes they will resign. I'm gonna put this in the E tier, possibly low D tier as well. Just for me, it wasn't a very enjoyable scenario. I really enjoyed the concept of actually paying tribute to an overlord and eventually overcoming them. But I think this was much better done in the Empire Earth 2 scenario in the Korean campaign than it was done here. Next up, we have Cyprus. For me, Cyprus was a bit boring as well. I think part of that is due to pushing with the Britons. Pushing with the Britons is always a bit of a slow, steady race, shall we say. I did like how the landing mechanics. So you land onto this onto Cyprus, and then you got to try and fight your way through to then capture the city, and then eventually defeat your opponent. It's gonna go in the C tier. It's not one of my favorite scenarios, but it's enjoyable enough. Next up, we have my least favorite historical battle, that is Dos Pilas. I think this is less due to the scenario itself and more due to the confusion during the scenario. So you try to defend one of the settlements, and then it looks like you're actually having a pretty good time of defending it, and all of a sudden, like, regardless of how well you've done up until that point, you then are basically evacuated to a second city. I wouldn't have minded this so much if I hadn't have used so much resources on keeping that first city available, and then having to rebuild my economy from scratch essentially. Had it been more clear in the scenario that this first city would probably be abandoned, or at least there was a chance of it happening, I would then have not spent so many resources keeping it alive, and then the rest of the scenario would have been a lot quicker. It's not also one of the ones I would enjoy much beyond that, as it is quite grindy, but it's I think that the confusion and the grindiness together made it a very unenjoyable experience for myself. Next up, we have Hastings, and I found this quite an enjoyable scenario overall. You are playing as the Franks trying to invade, I think it's Saxon England, if I'm not mistaken. Thematically it feels right. Obviously, the Normans did end up conquering the England. I think it's just an interesting campaign, interesting scenario overall. There's not any crazy mechanics in it, which in some ways actually helps this sort of scenario. Your end goal is to destroy the Saxons essentially, and you've got to go across the sea to go and do it. I just feel like it's very thematically sound. Next up, we have Kurakara. Kurakara was a weird one because, like, part of me really wants to like this scenario, and the other part of me did not at all. So it was very grindy in some aspects because you're against multiple enemies, and if I'm not mistaken, I think you have one ally, but they're not very useful. I could be wrong on the ally part, but the entire army are always quite significantly ahead of where you are in this scenario, which can make it feel again on that kind of grindy area. I'm also not a big fan of mirror matchups, and this is obviously all set in feudal Japan. Um, Beyond that, it's an okay enough scenario though, so we'll be in the C tier. Next up, we have Noyang Point. Noyang Point is one of those scenarios I really want to like. So I love the story behind the Admiral Yu Chin with the turtle ships. I played the Korean campaign, Empire, Sword of the Modern World, and I think it was really well done. This mission didn't feel quite as well done, if I'm 100% honest. One of the bonus missions is to defend the Wonder, which seems pretty much impossible with your with being completely outnumbered at the start. And beyond that, the mission is a bit on the grindy end again, and then eventually then fighting back the Japanese and then landing on where they've already taken over. Again, it's on that kind of grindier end. It's gonna go slightly behind Kurokawa for me. Next up, we have Kyoto. Uh, this I don't know. I feel kind of strange about this one as well. As a kid, I remember enjoying the concept behind this mission where you were essentially trying to claw your way back through Japanese territory. But on the execution side of things, when I replayed it more recently, again, it just felt like a boring grind to the end. And then then you have to use all these ships to then land on the opponent's area. And then they've got a massive wave of troops to then come and deal with you. And those kind of battles just do not appeal to me so much. I'm probably going to put this in the D tier next to Agincourt. This one also is another one of those scenarios I really didn't enjoy. This is Lake Boyang. This one, even more so than the other ones, it's grindy, and there's a time limit on it. So you've got to figure out the best route of doing everything as quickly as possible. And then once you've completed the time limit allotted part of the mission, you've then got to go and defeat your enemies back. It was just way too much of a grind to actually complete all of this. I was not a big fan of it. And next up, we have Lepanto. Now, unlike a lot of these other more grindy missions, I found this one really enjoyable, surprisingly. It's going to go in the A tier, just below Hastings. For me, yes, defending the Wonder in this kind of situation was kind of stressful. You don't have any particularly useful allies. There are the Greek, I think they're called the Greek cities or something like that. Or it's just called a Greek city. And they can make an ally of some description. They're not particularly useful though. And you're against a Turkish armada essentially, where they're constantly landing units on you, constantly attacking your shores. But I found defending in this way not too difficult, and I found it quite enjoyable. Unlike a lot of these other more grindy scenarios. And next up, we have Honfoglalas. I hate to use the word grinding again, but this one definitely has a bit of a grind to it. It's not. I found it more interesting though, at least, because like, there's a nomadic mechanic in this scenario where you don't necessarily have to transition to a standard economy for quite a while. I found that quite enjoyable. You're basically going to be attacking your enemies to get resources for a while. I thought that was at least an interesting mechanic as part of it. Next up, we had Manzikert. Now, as I said before, I'm not a big fan of fixed forces scenarios, and this one kind of behaves in some ways as a fixed forces scenario. That being said, you end up capturing cities which you can then retrain units from. I found this to be a really fun mechanic, honestly. I also feel like thematically the battle really does capture the essence of the battle as well. For me, it's going to be an S tier, probably one of the few you'll see here. Another one that'll be going to the S tier as well is Tor's mission. Tor's starts off kind of stressful, but once you've gotten over that initial kind of stress with the Berbers and Moors attacking your walls, and you get up to the castle at a relatively decent time, you're in a pretty good spot. You've got 3 TCs that can already be running, your opponent's in castle age, and you've got throwing axemen behind walls. So it's pretty defendable position. And then you can then go and do the baggage train afterwards. You can also do a speed run of this, which I've done as well. The reason I did the speed run more recently than the general playthrough is because I've done the general playthrough quite a few times. of how much I enjoy this mission. Definitely up there with one of the top missions in the entire game for me. Next up is Vinland Saga. Speaking of grindy missions I don't enjoy, this is definitely on that list. Probably even below Kyoto. I like the idea behind it where you're exploring the new world, trying to become this new superpower essentially, which is the Vikings. But the way in which it's done with for example, the Sea of Worms, where you can't traverse this area and you have to defeat an enemy on this on the next island and sacking and pillaging, like it just did not appeal to me in the same way. Like we'll talk about York in a second, but York did it a lot better in my opinion. But yeah, just was not a big fan of Vinland Saga. Next up is York. Now York for me isn't a top 5 historical battle. It is enjoyable enough. The reason I find it quite enjoyable though is not so much the mission itself, but more so due to the wide amount of variety in the mission you can do. There are so many ways to complete this mission that I find really, really interesting. I've only ever completed it 2 or 3 times, so I don't have not done all the different ways of doing it, but you can accumulate a certain amount of wealth. I think it's like 20,000 or 50,000 gold. It's something quite ridiculous. You can capture all the relics. You can defeat X number of enemies. You can destroy. I think there's like a couple of buildings that you have to destroy in one of the main areas. There's so many different ways of completing it, which I found really interesting. It again it is one of the more grindy scenarios, but I find that at least they've attached a greater purpose to it. I also love that you can destroy buildings for gold, like especially docks and whatnot for gold. I think markets as well, if I'm not mistaken. But that's going to do it for me today. What missions did you enjoy? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.